The Dynasty Startup Draft has come and gone. Now we're discussing what we are doing after our startup draft before the season. When depending on when you're watching this, there might be a month before the season, there might be a week before the season, there might be a whole other 6-7 months before the season. So whenever you're watching this, there's a lot of time to think about. But with all that in mind, Zach, we're diving into the things we're looking to do after our startup draft, what we're focusing on. The first topic I wanted to bring up to discuss, we got to assess our team needs after the startup draft. Where are we at? How are we stacking up compared to the rest of the league? And we need to create some pathways to address these team needs that we've assessed and put together. Zach, I'm going to kick it to you first and hear your thoughts on this topic, this over-encompassing point. We kind of melded our first 2 points together here, and that's okay. They're pretty similar. So what do you got for us?
Yeah, so obviously I want to address my team needs, right? But let's take a look around the league. Let's see who else needs what. Who else needs maybe what I offer as a position of strength? Who else might have something for me that's a position of weakness? Can a trade be made to benefit both? Do I have an excess of running backs because that was best player available, where another team has an excess of wide receivers and we can help each other out? A lot of times, and we didn't really talk about this in our startup draft, but sometimes I do get approached by people in startup draft like, hey, I'm looking for this. And I'm like, listen, let's talk after the draft. I've already made my decisions on who I'm drafting. Let's look at how our teams look after the draft, and then we can make this decision from there. So again, I look around the league, identify who's got positions of strength and who's got positions of weakness, and how does it line up with my roster? How can I benefit from it? How can they benefit from it? And how can we help each other at our positions of strength and our positions of weakness on our roster?
Zach, you nailed this point 100%. The most likely trade to get made is when one team has, excess depth or an area of strength, like you said, but they have a defined weakness. They go to a team with a weakness that matches up with their strength. They deal a position of strength to help with a position of weakness on their own team originally. So 100% you nailed that point. That is how you, by assessing your team needs and creating the pathways to address them, look at the rest of the team's needs. Who has the excess depth that you mentioned that you can possibly pull from that roster and fill a need of your own. So that is a great point. Moving on to my next one here. After a draft, I think one of the most important things we need to do, we need to confirm our team trajectory. Where is this team headed? What does our timeline look like for when we're competing? How long is it going to take to quote unquote rebuild? Even though we've never been built up, we'll still call it a rebuild for the time being, and establish a game plan. We need to figure out, are we set one way or the other to begin with? Are we a defined rebuild, a defined contender, or are we kind of stuck at that fork in the road where we need to make some decisions and we could morph this into a competitive team. We could just lean back and go into a rebuild. You got to decide on one or the other, because if you don't make a decision, you are going to end up in the middle. That's the one place we don't really want to be in. We want to be either competitive, we want to be either rebuilding and, increasing our value bank for the future and building up our pool of assets for the future and keeping the long term more in mind than the short term, but obviously making the best of short term values and things like that. But we need to make a decision and then follow up with the moves that reflect that team trajectory. If we decide we're rebuilding, we're not going to go trade for aging vets. If we are contending, we're not necessarily going to be trading for purely draft capital or young players that, yes, rookies are exciting, but you might have to pay a lot to get them, and they might not help your competitive roster this year. I love JSN, but if I have a competitive team right now, I'm not necessarily looking to go add JSN because I don't believe he's going to be a super helpful wide receiver to me year one. I'm not going to make a move like that. So you need to kind of make sure that whatever you decide the trajectory is, and that's one thing that is kind of hard to decide. Sometimes it helps to have a community behind you. We have one, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind, amazing community Discord with a bunch of guys who will help you kind of gauge your team, see where you're at, especially based on the, league settings, formatting, starting rosters, and things like that. So definitely need to keep that in mind, confirm that team trajectory. That should be, I'll assess team needs first, see what we can do to kind of fill holes. But even before that, looking at the team trajectory might be that much more important, just figuring out where this team is. Because you might have team needs if you're a rebuilding team, and your top team need might be a running back. But if you're rebuilding, running back doesn't really do a whole heck of a lot for you now anyway, with how short the shelf life on those guys seem to be. So picking that up, figuring out which the trajectory is, and then making the moves that reflect that the best to stay out of the middle. Like I said, that's the one place we don't want to be. I want to hear your thoughts on this if you have any, or feel free to dive on into your next point.
For me, Bob, I think you said it very well with what you said there about that point. So I'll just move on to the next. This applies to a lot in Dynasty. I want to be the first one there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'll explain how this matters here, right? Never in the history of a startup draft, Bob Van, have all 12 teams been satisfied with their draft.
No.
Never. It never happens. And you know this. You talked about this in one of your other videos. It's a great point. I'll follow up on it here. Who said something in the league chat? Who got sniped?
Mm-hmm.
Who's angry? Who missed out on a player? Use that information to your benefit, because now you need to be the first one on their doorstep, knocking on their door with a potential trade offer. Find out which league owners aren't happy with their draft. Can you benefit from this? Are they buying what you may want to sell, Bob? Are they selling what you may want to buy? You have to be the first one to find out, because a lot of times, if you're second, it's already too late. This applies to a lot. This applies to rebuilding. You want to be the first one to rebuild. You want to be the first one to buy win now players. You always want to be the first one. After your startup draft, once it's over, heck, even in the last 5 rounds, start looking at rosters. Start having discussions. Go back in the chat, see what you missed. Be the first one to address another team's needs. And how does that benefit you? Does it help you get players to help you win now? Does it help you get more rookie picks that you're trying to build for in 2024 and beyond? Be the first one there, Bob.
I love this point, mostly because the biggest takeaway here is the reason why it's so important to be the first one there. Be the first one kicking in the door. Don't just knock, kick in the door with an offer, or have some sort of ability to make a compelling argument for what you want to do, what you want to accomplish, and have an offer in mind too. Have that team assessed. Like we discussed, you get in their DMs, you say, I have a ton of running backs. You need a running back. You have a ton of wide receivers. I need a wide receiver. These are the discussions that you have right off the rip. And why it's so important to be the first one there is because once that need is met, that avenue is gone. They have less incentive to trade with you. They have less depth at a position of that you could have filled your roster with. That avenue depletes very quickly. And that's why it's so important to be aggressive and on top of things like this. This is an incredible way to, if you don't take advantage of this and pay attention to your league mates and things like that, you're going to fall up pretty quick because you're just missing on making the most of opportunities, which is something we've discussed in the past as well, which if you could just make the most of opportunities to improve your roster, you're going to improve your roster. But if you if you just let these opportunities slip away, your roster is going to slip away too faster than you even know it. So the last thing I want to discuss here, and we touched on it in the last bit a little bit, when it comes to just the in-draft strategy, now moving into the after, I want to find ways to build on the value we've built up on this roster. I want to find ways to continue on with the value bank we've built up, with that we've, stashed our cash away in, we've stashed our picks in, whatever the case is. I want to find ways to build on these things as opposed to doing nothing with it. Let's set up for next year. Let's trade these picks when they're the most valuable to get now competitive players on a roster next offseason before the rookie draft. Let's make the most of what we've added to this roster and not just sit on it. The worst thing you can do with any dynasty roster is just sit on it and not do anything with it. I'm not saying, look at it every single day and every single roster you have every single day and send out a trade offer or whatever the case is. But let's find ways to do these things that we've discussed, assess the team needs. How can we fill them? How can we start building this roster for the future? I think that some rebuilds could take longer than they have to because of the fact that you're not being the first one there on trade offers, being aggressive and making offers and looking through teams that have needs and needs you can fill with excess depth that you have in your roster, or just pieces that don't fit your trajectory anymore. I think if we could do our best to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible with our rebuilds and the assets we have, rebuilds could be a heck of a lot faster. There's a patience element, don't get me wrong. But at the end of the day, let's find ways to keep building on the value we've accrued through the draft. Having all these pieces is fun, but learning how to allocate them, that's the next step. Zach, feel free to touch on this point.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something here, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, but a really good way to do this, let's say, we talked about having a plan in the startup draft. Let's say our plan, we're not competing in 2023. Our plan is, hey, we're going for it 2024, 2025. We're going to be a powerhouse in this league. First 15 rounds of a startup draft, I've got some depth. I've got some starters. I've got some players I believe can improve upon their ADP. The next 5 rounds, the next 10 rounds, Bob, can we draft players that may be being overlooked and may be needed for a point later on down the road for another team? Say a big injury. Today, as of recording this, Tim Patrick got injured. Whose stock does that improve? Marvin Mims, Greg Dulcich, all these other guys. So what players can you draft after you've built your cachet of depth for your team? Now I'm just drafting to trade later at some point because it's the 20th round. Like, I'm not going to get anything valuable here, Hey, I love this guy. Maybe I can draft I can draft Isaiah Hodgins, and maybe he is the guy that comes out of that wide receiver room, and I can trade that to somebody else for value in a rookie draft later. So again, your point here, find ways to build on value you've accrued through the draft. Well, if I'm not really trying to win in 2023, what am I doing in the 20th round? I'm not really trying to find players who are going to, this guy's going to be drafted in the 5th round next year. No, that's very unlikely. And that's more luck than anything else. But can I find players that may serve other teams a purpose? Can I maybe, again, look at other rosters? Who needs what? Maybe I could take that player, and then I can trade that player for a 3rd round pick. These are just different ways you can kind of allocate what Bob is saying here and trying to build on the value that you accrue throughout the draft.
Yeah, this boils down to, what you're doing there is something I refer to as value farming or value scouting, finding ways to create value, basically. And what you're saying is finding those, whether it's a handcuff running back, somebody who's just kind of forgotten about in an offense. I think Isaiah Hodgins is a great example. I'm not saying he's going to make the thumbnail for this video or anything like that. But I will say that it's a great example because he is just kind of being left to the wind at this point. And if he does show out this season, I think you're definitely getting a 2nd round pick for the guy. And I think that can go for, what running backs do you have on your team that are handcuffs? Keep an eye on those guys. Can you trade them for close to what their value is if they were an activated handcuff, as I like to say, when they're needed to be a handcuff on a roster? Are you able to do that now, or do you have to wait? These things are okay if you're not trying to rack up points, especially, definitely okay. But finding ways to turn over the bottom of a roster, like you mentioned, beyond the 15th round or whatever you want to, make your cutoff of where you have like your uber valuable players where you're relying on starters from. Finding ways to make the most out of all of the pieces on your roster. And, it's cool to stash pieces, but at the end of the day, we want to turn these late round picks, much like we do with rookie picks, players that are drafted in the 5th round. We want to take the players that are drafted beyond the 20th round and trade them for 3rd round picks next year, 4th round picks next year, whatever the case is, because even if you take a 20th round pick, like you just mentioned, Zach, I don't know players specifically going there, but if you're able to trade them for a 3rd round pick, those 3rd round picks are being drafted before the 20th round right now. So you automatically find a way to increase value on what you draft to begin with, see what you can do with those players that you drafted late in your rounds, and then continue again to build on the value that you were stuck with drafting somebody in the 20th round. All right. How are you going to find a way to use them to add more value beyond the value that they suggest that they added to your roster by drafting them with the 23rd round pick?
Again, I just did a startup the other day, and I looked at some of these later rounds. What are we looking at right now in the NFL? We're looking at running back problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at all these teams with interesting running back situations. Let's look at Jonathan Taylor with the Indianapolis Colts. Evan Hull, 18th round pick. This is exactly what we just talked about. Las Vegas Raiders, Josh Jacobs. Where can I get Zamir White? Seattle Seahawks, Bob. We talked about this before the video. Mm-hmm. Where can I get Kenny McIntosh? You could probably get Kenny McIntosh after the 20th round. Yeah. You could turn Kenny McIntosh right now. You just said somebody offered you a Kenny McIntosh for a 3rd, and you were thinking of accepting it. So that just goes into the point that we just talked about there.